It is the mark of an educated man to look for precision in each class of things just so far as the nature of the subject admits. That's from Aristotle from the Nicomachean Ethics. So how much precision can we have in our concepts? We should not demand more precision than a given subject allows, but we should not settle for less than that. So how can we know that we've obtained the proper level of precision? Well, that's what philosophy is setting out to do, is to ask that question. So you will know that you have obtained this level of precision that you should have when your knowledge is organized into principles, and your principles are integrated into a reality-oriented, internally consistent whole. And that's what we're seeking together as we work through this Objectivism book study. This is a robust Christian response to Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff. I'm Cody Leibel. This is our 6th meeting. In this and the next meeting, we are going to be finishing out our discussion of Chapter 2, the Anteroom of Epistemology. This week, we are taking pages 52 through 54, the perceptual level as the given, and also pages 55 through 62, the primary choice is the choice to focus or not. So next week, we're actually going to go into a little bit more into this volition topic as well. And that's going to include things like human actions, mental and physical, as both caused and free, and volition as axiomatic. I mention that because I want you to see where our reading this week culminates. It's sort of a 2 parts to discuss volition. So in the subsection that we looked at this week, here are 2 of the main ideas. The first one is the perceptual level as the given. Let me introduce that idea. So Leonard Peikoff introduced this framework of dividing our experiences into 3 levels: sensation, perception, and conception. One reason why this section needed to be included in this book is that within the history of philosophy, one of the most influential figures, David Hume, who lived from 1711 to 1776, disastrously advocated for skepticism. And this influenced the rest of philosophy after him. And in part, his advocacy of skepticism was due to misunderstandings about how a person's mind can move from the level of bare sensation to the level of forming generalizations and concepts. You notice he skipped a step. There's sensation, and then he tried to figure out how to get from sensation to conception. That's difficult to do. So Peikoff answers Hume's arguments by highlighting certain facts about the differences between sensation versus perception. And once you read his account of how perception is different from sensation, it clarifies the issue quite a bit. So the more you're familiar with the history of Western philosophy, the easier it's going to be to understand the significance of the material from this week that we're working through. But, so we're working through the proposed answers that he gives, and I think these are compelling. If you are familiar with those challenges that have been raised throughout the history of philosophy, that'd be helpful. But if you are fairly new to studying the history of Western philosophy, that this reading is going to get you on the right track, at least, so that when you go back and you do explore Hume or Kant, you're going to see, I think, in more clarity what mistakes were being made by them as you were studying them. So it'll save you some unnecessary confusion. So that was the section, just a quick overview on the section on perception. We can discuss it in more detail. But just to preview where we're going for this discussion, the longer part of the reading this week was the primary choice as the choice to focus or not. So here we're getting into the theory of free will or volition. And I prefer the term volition to free will because I think there are some confusions around the definition of free will, but we'll get into that. So here we get into an area in which Jacob Brunton and Calvinist thinkers in general, myself included, are not going to align with objectivism. That doesn't mean that everybody here on the video is going to disagree, though, because there are people here who are Calvinist and non-Calvinist. So Jacob Brunton would advocate a view of human volition that is compatible with God being meticulously sovereign over all things. Let me tell you a bit about what that means. So in the words of Derek Thomas, who is writing at Ligonier, nothing happens without God's willing it to happen before it happens, and willing it to happen in the way that it happens. That's the idea of God's meticulous sovereignty. That's the Calvinist position. We should note that Calvinists do distinguish between several senses of the term will as applies to God's will. And that's a whole other discussion. So the extent to which there is a disagreement between Calvinism and objectivism, and how much there's the disagreement, in what way there's the disagreement, how that matters, that's something that I'd love to talk about with you today. From my past conversations with Jacob Brunton, I'm persuaded that Jacob is correct, that Calvinism is correct, and that the objectivists are mistaken. But we want to hear other views on the video today as well. So I believe that the objectivists are mistaken where they diverge with what is necessitated by the doctrines of Calvinism. Specifically, I believe they're mistaken on the idea of libertarian free will. And there's philosophical reasons, not just religious reasons, why we might want to be suspicious of this doctrine called libertarian free will. We can explain that more as we get into the material. But I believe Peikoff is advocating libertarian free will, or at least I would say that his interpreters today, the objectivists today, would say, yeah, we are talking about libertarian free will. And I'm not sure how much Peikoff lands on that issue within this chapter. That's something that we can discuss. So that said, even though there are some disagreements that I have with this chapter, the chapter does highlight important topics about human volition that Jacob and I would gladly affirm. On the topic of the fundamental mental choice being whether or not to focus, I agree. On the concept of evasion and on the idea that it is important as a moral concept, that evasion is the root of evil, I agree. And so much of this is going to be useful whether or not I agree on libertarian free will or not. So let's go into the reading, and I'll just point out, if we read, I don't know what it was, we read a handful of pages, and I agree just about with every point that I see from 52 all the way to the middle of 59. And then when it gets into that section on 59, halfway through all the way to 60, all of a sudden I say, oh, here's the libertarian free will. That's how I see it. Now, I'm going to move through the material just line by line to see if there's any points that you guys want to bring out or that I think are worth highlighting. Before I do, I want to point out we've already got a couple of questions from Andrew Boone. We've got questions from Jacob Karn and from Chad, from Isaac, and I'm sure lots of material from Jacob Brunton. So anyone want to raise any additional points that you want to make sure we hit in our material this week? This would be a good time.
I would just add, because you brought it up in your overview, the idea of our idea of volition being compatible with meticulous sovereignty. It's going to be important to become even more precise than that, because on the Molinist view, meticulous sovereignty is compatible with libertarian free will, right? And so we can get into the details of this later, but this is one of the reasons why I think it's not helpful to talk about volition or free will in the framework of compatibilist versus incompatibilist. I think we should focus on just the nature of volition itself, and then whether it happens to be compatible with other things is a separate question.
Thanks for pointing that out. And Jacob has papers on this, and hopefully we'll get some of those published at christianintellectual.com in the near future, or accessible there, because what he has to say, it was illuminating to me when he reframed the issue in terms of let's define volition before we get into that discussion about compatibilism versus incompatibilism. Okay, and then some other questions Isaac had raised, he wanted to mention about the importance of evasion. We'll definitely get there at the end. And Chad had brought up about comparing what is said here to the perspective that Sam Harris's book has on free will. And then Jacob Karn had raised some issues about Turretin compared to Van Til, compared to Peikoff. And I think those will all be, so if you get to the point where we're in the discussion and you're thinking about that issue, go ahead and just interject. I would love to hear that. Let me move through in the material now. So let's start with, we're on the top of page 52. He points out that distinction that I mentioned between sensation and perception. And then he says a sensation is an irreducible state of awareness produced by the action of a stimulus on a sense organ. Irreducible here means incapable of being analyzed into simpler conscious units. Now, I would want to borrow that definition of irreducible when we get over to the topic of volition. I'd want to say, when he says that the choice to focus is irreducible, I would say that's incapable of being analyzed into simpler conscious units. I think that would be helpful. Let me go forward though. To go to the bottom of that page, you do not encounter an isolated ephemeral color patch or a play of fleeting sensations, but an enduring thing, an object, an entity. And this is where Peikoff is departing from David Hume, if you're familiar with his work. Let me go on. The reason that you see an entity is that you have experienced many kinds of sensations from similar objects in the past, and your brain has retained and integrated them and has put them together in the form of an indivisible whole. And this we know by direct perception. We know that this is the case. We just by introspection, by our direct experience with how we perceive. And he's correct as far as I understand. There is a difference between sensation that's not integrated versus perception that is integrated, and it's indubitable to me. Any comments on that? Jacob, do you have any thoughts? Jacob Brenton?
No, nothing important. I think it's a very helpful distinction, and it reminds me of a paper from Tim McGrew where he's talking about epistemology, and he uses the example of, when we look at a garden, we see individual flowers and things like that, whereas an artist who's going to paint the garden, reproduce the image of the garden, is going to be able to focus in on focus in on individual aspects that we don't pick up on when we just glance at it, because we see it as, a rose or a leaf, whereas the artist has trained himself to kind of almost go back to that sensational state of awareness in order to see the greenness of the leaf in relation to the backdrop of the colors behind it and things like that. So I think just the idea that thinking about the sensational level is an achievement after the perceptual level. It's not something that we're able to or that we naturally lapse back into as adults or even as mature children. It's something that takes effort to go back into, so to speak.
There's a really awesome section about how music relates to that in Rand's book, The Romantic Manifesto, and especially, I'm a music guy, so it was neat to see that. So if you haven't checked out that book, definitely do. Go to the middle of page 53. A perception in Ayn Rand's definition is a group of sensations automatically retained and integrated by the brain of a living organism, which gives it the ability to be aware not of single stimuli, but of entities, of things. And objectivism would hold that we are able to perceive things, not just isolated splotches of color. You can only do that by a process of abstraction or by intentionally attempting to see it as that. So direct experience, according to objectivism, means the perceptual level of consciousness, and this is all engaging with Hume. Go to page 54 at the top. Epistemologically, however, the perceptual stage comes first. So this is echoing what Jacob just said. Developmentally, sensation is the earlier stage, but epistemologically, once we are adults, when we are perceiving things, we are perceiving them. All right, move on. If one seeks to prove any item of human knowledge on any subject, he must begin with the facts of perception. This is useful polemically. If you ever get into a discussion with a Ventilian or something like that, you would say, this is my premise. And you would ask them if they disagree with that. These facts constitute the base of cognition. They are the self-evident and the incontestable by reference to which we validate all later knowledge. If somebody's going to disagree with that, I would simply say, okay, what is your standard here? How do you propose that we proceed? Because what I'm able to do is point. Do you have that going for you and for your system? All right, we have this section on Hume, and we'll skip ahead a little bit. He points out in the middle of this page, the grasp of entities is an epistemological primary, and that's contra the skeptics. And then he points out there can be no advice where man has no power to choose his course of behavior. So now we're getting into the question of volition. Is there anything else that anyone wanted to say about the issue of perception versus sensation, that distinction? Otherwise, I'm happy to move on to the bigger topic, which is looking at the idea of focus. Okay, go to top of page 55. The primary choice as the choice to focus or not. Man, according to objectivism, is not moved by factors outside of his control. He is a volitional being who functions freely. So when I saw the word freely, I wondered, what is the precise meaning of that? And he's going to get into that. A course of thought or action is free if it is selected from two or more courses possible under the circumstances. In such a case, the difference is made by the individual's decision, which should not have to be what it is, i.e., which could have been otherwise. So as I'm reading this, since I am a Calvinist, I'm asking myself, in what sense could it have been otherwise? The Calvinist position, and Jacob, if you want, this might be a good time to just briefly overview it, but it's that there is a distinction between natural inability and moral inability. And so, for example, when we reject God, it's not because we don't have the actual choice. We do have an actual choice. We have a natural ability to choose God or to reject him. But we always, until we are regenerated by the Holy Spirit, this is the Calvinist position, we will always fail to follow Christ as our Savior and as our Lord. And we will always fail to, not because of a natural inability to, but rather because of a moral inability to. And by moral, we mean we are free to do whatever we want, but we don't want to follow him because we love sin. Our hearts are enslaved to a love of sin. So this idea is from Jonathan Edwards, this distinction. And this is helpful because it allows us to say, yes, we did have a meaningful choice in front of us. And yes, we are morally culpable. Because how would you have moral culpability, as it describes in Romans 1, if you didn't have choice? So because we actually do have a natural ability, we have moral culpability. But because of our sin nature, because of what we love, we do not ever choose the way that God would have us choose. Jacob Brunn, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah. So I think it's helpful and important to point out that this isn't necessarily unique to Calvinism, right? So one of the reasons I'm a Calvinist is because I see libertarian free will as irrational, right? So even if I wasn't a Christian, I would see it as irrational, and I would disagree with libertarian free will. I think that's important to say, or at least hopefully it's helpful to say. The reason why is because it seems to, well, it does violate what is called the principle of sufficient reason, meaning that in any given situation, an action that for any given action, there must be a sufficient causal explanation for that action, right? That's the principle of sufficient reason. And the way that libertarian free will is often formulated, and it's very similar to what Peikoff says here, is in any given situation, you have the ability to do or do otherwise. And that would mean that there isn't a sufficient causal explanation, because if the term sufficient means sufficient to bring about X and not X, right? That's the whole concept of sufficiency when it comes to causation. So to put it a little bit more simply, does Peikoff mean here that all things are equal in the doing or doing otherwise? Or, as we would say, are there some things that are unequal in that? Meaning, if I choose to, let's use an example. If I'm on a diet and I see a commercial for, I don't know, my favorite dessert, chocolate something, and then I go and indulge, did the TV rob me of my free will? Did the TV rape me? To use common rhetoric. Or some people would say, well, you have the choice to choose not to indulge or not, or choose to indulge or not. But the question is, do you do so because you want to, or do you do so against what you want? Is there ultimately something in your desires that leads to the choice, or is it something apart from your desires? And this gets to what Cody was talking about with the difference between natural ability and moral ability, right? So a natural inability to choose to do the right thing would be if I'm supposed to get up out of this chair, but I'm physically tied to the chair. This is the example that Edwards uses. If I'm commanded to get out of the chair, but I'm physically tied to the chair, then I can't be morally culpable for not getting out of the chair, because I have a natural inability. There's a physical inability for me to do what I'm being told to do. And so I can't be held morally culpable. However, if I'm commanded to get out of the chair and I'm not tied to the chair, there's nothing physically holding me to the chair, but I'm just so damn lazy that I can't bring myself to want to get out of the chair, then I am morally culpable. And the reason why is because it's a condemnation of my character. The inability to do what I'm supposed to do is an inability rooted in my character, in my desires, which are very moral things. And so that's our position. Our position is you can do, you have the freedom to do whatever you most want to do in any given situation where all things are equal. Whereas the person who advocates for libertarian free will, and seemingly Peikoff also here, is going to say, no, in any given situation, all things being equal, including your desires, you have the ability to do or not to do, meaning you can act against your strongest desire. It might be that your really truly strongest desire is to remain sitting in the chair, but you have the ability to contradict your strongest desire. And then the question is, of course, well, where did that choice come from? Did it just pop out of nowhere? It seems arbitrary. In fact, it seems like you can't really even say that it was you who chose that, because what is it that we're talking about when we say you as an agent, other than your beliefs, your motivations, your desires, your values, etc. And we'll get more into that later, obviously, as we get into what he talks about regarding values and volition and things like that. But that is the essential issue here, is when we're talking about the ability to do or do otherwise, we're talking about the ability to act against your motivations, against your desires, against your own wishes and psychological nature. We're not talking about external forces being forced upon you. We agree with the advocate of libertarian free will on the nullification of morality when it comes to external things being forced on you. But our position is that an inability which arises from your own moral failings, your own moral motivations, is morally culpable.
And
And
then there will.
also, I was just going to say, Jacob, that would be the difference between the Calvinist view and like Sam Harris's view. In Sam Harris's view, your choices are the result, strictly speaking, of this interaction between certain parts of your body and your brain, where you couldn't have done otherwise owing to the laws of physics. And so I just wanted to mention that because I remember you mentioning that in your question.
That's helpful. So there's a distinction there between, it's not the laws of physics that have necessarily determined, but we do believe that a Calvinist would say that the decisions that you made in the past, the character that you have shaped yourself to be, that actually does make the decisions, and that character that you have shaped yourself to be it really is a human being with character that's making decisions, but it also really did have causes, and so we wouldn't see any difficulty with understanding God's meticulous sovereignty as God was the one that brought us into being and that knew what it was that he was bringing into being. All right, let's go on to the next section on page 55. So he says, let us begin with an overview of the objectivist position. And let me summarize it. Number one, consciousness is an active process, not a motionless medium, such as a mirror which passively reflects reality. Two, the actions of consciousness required on the sensory perceptual level are automatic, but on the conceptual level, they're not. And then three, man's basic freedom of choice, according to objectivism, is to exercise his distinctively human cognitive machinery or not. So it's to think or not to think. And then three more points. No, there's a lot more. So it's over the next couple of pages. He's summarizing. Point number 4, man's power of volition is the power to seek such awareness of reality or to dispense with it. His choice is to be conscious in the human sense or not. Point 5, I think, the primary choice, according to objectivism, the one that makes conceptual activity possible, is the choice to focus one's consciousness. We're now on the bottom of page 56. I would say his 6th main point here is that focus in the conceptual realm names a quality of purposeful alertness in a man's mental state. Focus is the state of goal-directed mind committed to attaining full awareness of reality. I have no problems with any of the things he's saying here. This all is perfectly consistent with my views.
Let me interject real fast, Cody, just because I don't want us to lose something really valuable because of our attention to the free will debate, which is also valuable. I love this conception or this idea of focus and the way that he talks about it. And this is something that I think Christians could really get a lot of value from when it comes to the idea of mental focus and mental effort. That idea is so lost on many people today, but especially it seems in the Christian world, where physical effort is praised, right? If you go and work hard as a mechanic, then you're seen as strong and capable or whatever. But if you go and work hard at a computer, maybe as a software engineer, Isaac, or in accounting, or reading law books, right? That is seen as not real effort, not real difficult, sort of soft, which is, I think, completely opposite if you've got a healthy view of man, of anthropology, where we are embodied souls, embodied minds, and the essential of humanity, which sets us apart from the animals, is our spirituality, our intellect, which I would say are virtually one and the same thing. That's not to discount physicality, which is very good, but the thing that makes physicality good about manness or humanness is its physicality directed by a mind. And so I would love for us to really try to resurrect this idea of mental effort and mental focus as a virtue and really emphasize that. I love it.
In the middle of page 57, we go to his 7th point summarizing the objectivist view on this focus topic. So he's saying man must be prepared when necessary to conceptualize new data. This involves many processes, such as seeking out common denominators among observed concretes, formulating definitions, and integrating new material into one's past context of knowledge. There's virtue, he's saying here. It's necessary and it's virtuous to do this, to seek definitions. All right, an 8th point, full awareness does not mean omniscience. It means the awareness attainable by a man who seeks to understand some object by using to the full the evidence, the past knowledge, and the cognitive skills available to him at the time. So every bit of learning and knowledge and understanding comes within a context, of course. Go on to page 58. He's talking about mental drift here. So there is the possibility of being partially aware, and that's the opposite of being conscientious. And so he's advocating being conscientious. On the next paragraph, he says, to focus one's mind means to raise one's degree of awareness. In essence, it consists of shaking off mental lethargy and deciding to use one's intelligence. The state of being in focus and full focus means the decision to use one's intelligence fully. And I agree with Jacob that we have a mental drift problem within Christianity, and I can speak especially within the subculture that is Reformed. There's definitely a tendency of mental drift. Going to the middle of the page there, he writes, this qualifies as an instance of full focus if you are carrying out wide awake a mental purpose you have set for yourself. And he's here answering a sort of a question that might come up. Somebody might say, are you saying that we have to be thinking and solving problems all the time? And of course the answer is no, that's not what he's saying. You need to be aware that the need for thinking could arise at any time. So you're driving, well, you set your purpose, you're driving a car, you set your purpose to paying attention to what's in front of you and to managing your vehicle, but you're not solving a problem like mentally, conceptually. But you are alert to the need that you could immediately have to solve a problem. If somebody gets in your way, you immediately have to be ready. So you're alert. And the level of alertness that is necessary for you changes depending on the situation. If you're laying down in your bed, it's different. But if you're watching a TV show, it could be different depending on if you have a deadline coming up or something like that. So you don't always need to be solving problems, but you do need to know whether or not you need to be solving problems and potentially be ready. He writes, focus is not the same as thinking. It need not involve problem solving or the drawing of new conclusions. Focus is the readiness to think, and as such, the precondition of thinking. At the bottom, or at the top of page 59, we see this exertion is work, and it is experienced as such, not pain, but work in the sense of basic mental effort. He says the exertion of such effort never becomes automatic. It has to be willed continually. And then we get in the middle of 59 to the place where I would have a lot of questions about what he's saying, where he says the choice to focus is man's primary choice. Primary means presupposed by all other choices and itself irreducible. As I mentioned earlier, this idea of irreducible, if you just mean that from the perspective of your own consciousness, you cannot divide it into any smaller pieces, I would agree with that. Whereas if what he's saying is that there is no principle of sufficient causation applying here, I would disagree with him. So, in the margin, I just asked, in what sense does he mean it's irreducible? Does he mean not explained by prior facts? Because in my view, the everything about human beings is explained by prior facts. Any discussion on that?
I think
This is why. Oh, go ahead, Isaac.
the sense I get from this is that whenever you're presented with any generic choice, whether you are focusing or not will determine the range of choices you choose. So if you're presented with a choice or a range of choices, are you is your mind currently focused? That will determine whether or not you choose these set of choices versus the set of choices that an unfocused mind might choose. I don't know if that made any sense, but
Yes, yeah, that is what he's saying.
I think he would even be explicit about that. I think elsewhere he said, even in some cases, once you have made that primary choice to focus, the rest actually follows as a consequence. But what I wanted to share was, first off the bat, I've noticed that it's very easy in these kind of conversations about free will and morality to do what Rand would call a package deal unintentionally. Like a lot of people, we have some people that we are friends with online who are very against Calvinism. And one of them was saying, well, look, if God even knows or determines, everything that's going to happen, then you didn't make that choice. Well, look at what he just did. He inferred a bunch of premises that he didn't mention and assumed that he was saying the same thing as just a one-step kind of logical inference. And this fact that the choice to focus is primary may be true, but it doesn't necessarily follow, Cody, like you were saying, that there is no sufficient reason or sufficient set of facts to bring that about. And this is, I think, a problem for him here, because he said on the next page, on page 60, this is not to deny that a person's ideas can have effects on his mental state. And he seems to be saying that it can become easier for you. There can be less resistance when you make the choice to focus repeatedly over your life. It can become easier in the future to do that. And this may be my fault for not getting this, but it seems hard to see how, if that choice is irreducible causally, how could it become easier for you if that's going to be a first cause, as he says, every single time with no prior cause behind it? He might say that there's some cause, but there's at least a sliver of it that's undetermined. I'm not sure. I would have trouble even conceiving of that. But I think that the very fact that you think about Rand's characters in her novels, the heroes in those novels trust each other with a lot. They'll say, I took this action knowing that you would be there to support me and would be there to make the right decision. They're saying, I know that your mental state would be in focus because of all these things that happened in your past to make you who you are. Rand even says this in the Romantic Manifesto. She says, I had to make Howard Rourke a certain way in chapter 1, otherwise in chapter 20, there's no way he could make that choice. So it does seem like it'd be hard for Peikoff to maintain that your good moral choices early in your life can actually help those choices come in later. But I might be missing something.
I have some ideas about that question because you'd brought it up to me over Messenger. So you had asked, like, how is it that the primary choice is irreducible? That if that's true, then right thinking can make subsequent instances of that choice easier. And my response is a little bit scattered, but here's what I would suggest. I can perhaps grant that a primary choice is irreducible in some sense, but not probably in the exact sense that Peikoff means here, depending on if you were to disambiguate. So it is irreducible in the sense that it is a direct act of the will, and that is the part of our minds that makes the choice. So it's a direct act. Now, what the individual person's will desires is, in my view, something that has been shaped by prior causes, but the fact that the will does desire and does choose is to be considered as the primary fact when you're looking at human action. Within the context of a discussion about human action, the choice of the person is the primary, because that choice is the fact that led to the action. So I'm thinking that this account of how this all works is going to differ from Peikoff's. I think that Peikoff understands the will and the conceptual faculty to be the same thing. I think that he says that at the end of this reading, that the volition, will, the conceptual faculty, he just equates them. They just are the one thing. So on my understanding of these topics, that's not the case. That I wouldn't exactly equate those things. There is a component of our mind that makes choices. There's a component of our mind that analyzes facts. And those two work together in order to form concepts. That's true, but they still are distinguishable. So on my understanding of these topics, I don't see a difficulty in seeing how somebody could have a history of right thinking, and that could make subsequent instances of right thinking easier. So this is not explaining Peikoff's view, but my view. The amount of willpower that it takes to follow sound methods of thought will be less if you have more practice in those methods. That's clear. So imagine if you were going to read a sentence out loud and you'd never read that sentence before. It would take quite a bit of concentration to do it exactly the way you wanted to with the correct sense. But if you had read it 5 times before out loud and practiced, it would be easier because there's a mental path that you have trailblazed. And so the amount of exertion is different. So anytime you have this experience of following a mental path that's already been blazed, it's less taxing, and your body is not going to be sending signals to your mind, hey, my ability to focus is diminishing. Maybe you want to consider preserving calories. And when you only have a limited amount of willpower per day. You only have a limited amount of the ability to make decisions per day. This is something that psychologists will explain. They can quantify it. They can say you've reached the point where you are exhausted from making decisions. So awareness of a given object does become easier with practice. The fact that this applies to even self-awareness, like self-awareness about your method. Am I being honest right now? You can get better at being honest with yourself with practice. So if you ask yourself over the course of the day, do you ever stop and say, hey, am I on task? Have I checked my to-do list? That mental habit, you can get better at it, of being self-aware about how you're using your time, being aware of your surroundings, of being aware of how, are you drifting mentally? Are you forgetting things that you should have been attending to, your responsibilities? So you can become self-aware just like that for a few moments, enough to ask yourself, am I on task? And that's self-consciousness. And it's something that we practice to a lesser or to a greater extent. And it's a habit that we get better at if we decide that we believe that habit is valuable. So you see, there's a cyclical relationship there. You decide that the habit is valuable. And then because of the fact that you've placed a value on it, then you'll be more motivated to implement that practice. And then as you implement that practice, you become more aware of its value over time. So that's how I think that our past thinking could shape our character, and our character could shape our future thinking in a circular pattern. Andrew, does that help at all? I don't know if you're there, Andrew. Okay, I'm going to move forward.
Can I actually say something to that?
Go ahead.
I think that because you brought up the term in multiple usages in what you were talking about in your explanation, which I thought was good, and it's the concept of a habit. And so Peikoff in his, on page 56, the second to last paragraph, when he talks about focus in the conceptual realm, names a quality of purposeful alertness in a man's mental state. That idea of quality could also, in a sense, refer to like a disposition. So in historical thought, and talking like even with Aquinas, he talks about a habit being a disposition according to which something is disposed well or badly. And so being good or bad belongs to the very concept of habit. And so it's the idea when we were talking about, are these irreducible, or is there room to develop and grow focus, in the sense that it's not irreducible? There can be this gradual improvement, like you were talking about, and that's by virtue of habit. It's this disposition of your intellect and your will that's drawn towards a certain action or outcome. And habit, I guess, also kind of relates to our notion of free will, and kind of what we were talking about is that people have different habits and dispositions or qualities of their intellect or will that cause them to make distinct decisions. And so I think understanding focus, specifically that term that he uses, quality, or we could even say disposition, is important to understanding the whole concept of what it means to focus.
Thanks for that. Yeah, anyone that's been a parent or that's been a teacher will see that you do have the ability to bring people to focus on things, not directly, but you can create a situation in which people are motivated to focus on something. And I mean, it's like, imagine if you were reading a book and somebody comes up to you and they say, hey, I want to talk to you, and you're still reading. Like you're aware that there is this experience of, I had to direct my attention from here to here. We are self-aware of that. And that brings me to a different question that Andrew had asked over Messenger. He said, how did Rand arrive to this conclusion that this choice to focus is a primary choice? And I think the answer to that is introspection, just self-observation and logic about that. So if you're not focusing, you're not in control of the reins of your mind. You need to seize the reins of your mind. And this is something that we have direct awareness of. Just like I mentioned, when somebody interrupts you in your reading and you can direct your focus, you have the choice. You have the choice right there to just continue reading and ignoring them because you don't feel like turning your attention. You have the awareness that it's mental work to turn your attention. So that and if you're really not sure about that, imagine this. Imagine if it's first thing in the morning and you're sitting there looking at your phone and somebody tries to talk to you and you haven't had your coffee yet. Or imagine if it's late at night. There's a difference in the perception of how much work it is. So this is all stuff that we can just observe. I think we know these things by observation. All right. So I think that explains how Rand came to an account of that. There were some other topics that Andrew had raised. He had raised this question of, do we have instances in Scripture of this concept of evasion that we're going to get to? So we'll make sure and get there. And Isaac, if you have things you want to say about that, and Andrew, if you have things, let's try to get there in the reading in our remaining time. So we get to the section where at the top of 61, we explain evasion, dishonesty, non-reality orientation, being ruled by emotions and whims. I would compare that to 2 Peter 3:5, that speaks of how people are willingly ignorant. That's a category. Self-deception is a biblical idea. Eve deceived herself. And in Romans 1:18, in that section, it talks about how people became dark in their minds by their own choice. In Luke 12:56, we hear Jesus call people hypocrites because they didn't understand the signs of the times. They chose not to. They were hypocrites. So he's saying that you're morally culpable. And so we have lots of attestations in Scripture of the ability to self-deceive. The entire book of Proverbs is dedicated to wisdom, and wisdom is seeking knowledge and not deceiving yourself and not being like this unwise young man who ends up embracing the woman that is off limits. That whole story is about self-deception. And you find it many places. You find it in Jeremiah. The heart is deceitful above all things, desperately sick, who can understand it? In James 1:22, he warns about deluding yourselves. In 1 John 1:8, if we say that we have no sin, we are deceiving ourselves. We know that this is a biblical concept. So, and not only is it a biblical concept, it's a core concept. Self-deception misunderstanding and purposely misunderstanding reality. That's the sin that Eve committed. That's the sin that Adam committed. That's what got us in our predicament of sin in the first place. That's what led to sin. So I would say that, if you're trying to understand a philosophical approach to what is sin, it is purposely not being reality oriented. That's one way that you could approach it. Any thoughts on that?
I keep thinking of this story in my head with regards to this stuff. Self evasion, self-deception, focus, self-awareness. I always think about, for me, like when I'm reading about focus here, I kept drawing myself back to the idea of self-awareness. I don't know about you guys, but whenever I've thought about, like, why do I think the way that I do? Why am I so meticulous about certain things? It always comes back to me to self-awareness. At some point in my life, I became self-aware, and it was a train that started and never stopped. Once you become self-aware, I think to a certain degree, you just keep becoming more self-aware and you get better at thinking. And so this is like the idea of focus and where that came from. But I was thinking, like, what caused me to become self-aware? I don't really know. But this story came to mind from my past. When I was in middle school, I think I was like cooking eggs, and I've got all kinds of things out, and there was a knife on the counter. And I think I was moving the pan across the stove, and I knocked the knife off a table, and it flings into the air, and it's spiraling, and it crashes on the ground. And I react to the situation, and I kind of throw my hands in the air, jump up and say, I didn't do it. And my dad was standing there, and he looks at me and he goes, yes, you did. You did that. And I kind of stood there thinking to myself, I did do that. Why did I say that I didn't do that? And this is just me thinking in my head. And I wonder, if my dad never said that to me, would I have actually continued to think that I didn't do that it wasn't my fault? I was aware of the danger of the situation, that a really dangerous situation was happening before my eyes. And my reaction to it was, I don't want to be responsible for whatever is about to happen here. I didn't do that. But the reality is that I did do that. And my dad made me aware of that and made me think and become more self-aware of what I was doing, and aware of my own self-deception and evasion of that reality. And Ayn Rand says something, or Peikoff says something about the difference between I wish and it is. So the middle school unaware Isaac was wishing that he wasn't responsible for whatever might happen to the knife flying through the air. But the disciplined Isaac realized, well, you were responsible for whatever was about to happen there, because you were the cause of that knife flinging through the air.
It sounds like your self-awareness consisted in realizing that you were capable of confusing an it is with an I wish. And that's what we see in the top of page 62. Reality to the contrary notwithstanding, he does not want the fact to be real or the policy to be necessary, so he decides to blank out on the offending datum. We have the capacity to do that. And if you read Atlas Shrugged, there's an entire character that's devoted to that, James Taggart, that practice. And much of the story of Atlas Shrugged consists of the villains blanking out on reality on purpose and then discovering what the consequences will be. It's the problem of placing a feeling over the truth. It's a problem of, if you would go back to what we were learning about in the metaphysics, failing to recognize the primacy of existence, that consciousness doesn't create just by itself. You can compare this mindset that people have of trying to recreate reality by their consciousness to the transhumanism movement. I don't have to get into details about all the different ways that comes into play, but with sexual identity and with just identity in general, saying I'm a black person when I'm actually a white person, like transhumanism is a word that encompasses all those ideas, but that doesn't get us blocked on YouTube. And the issue there is confusing an I wish with an it is, and not recognizing the distinction there. So in the middle of page 62, but such a feeling is merely a precondition, not a cause or explanation. The choice to capitulate to it is irreducible. No matter what his emotions, a sane man retains the power to face facts. So Peikoff is applying, I shouldn't say Rand, but Peikoff is applying this idea of evasion in the sense of, does a person really have culpability when they choose not to face the facts? And the answer is yes. He goes on, if an emotion is overwhelming, he retains the power to recognize it and to defer cognition until he can establish a calmer mood. So no excuses. You really do have the power. This reminds me of 1 Corinthians 10:13. No temptation has seized you except for what is common to man. You still are culpable. That verse reminds us that we are actually culpable, and that we actually have it within our power to say no to temptation. It's reality or your feelings. That's the determining choice that each person has to make. So then we see in the last part of this section, the process of evasion, as we will see, is profoundly destructive. Epistemologically, it invalidates a mental process. Morally, it is the essence of evil. According to objectivism, evasion is the vice that underlies all other vices. Once I pointed out that I thought presuppositionalism was the original sin. And you can understand the sense in which I would mean that, because if you were trying to place an I wish in your method of thought over an it is, and I'm able to perceive it by this means, then you're actually you're being mentally dishonest. And that blanking out of the responsibility for honesty, that pattern, is what the presuppositionalists are doing. And it's also what Eve did. All right, let's see other questions that we didn't get to. I wanted to ask Jacob, you had brought up Turretin and you'd brought up Van Til and Opar. What are your thoughts on all that?
Well, I was just asking because I'd come across, and I think there's one, and I'm not sure if his page has been mentioned on here, but Josh Summer, has some YouTube videos and he's written a blog as well. I was reading some of his interaction with some different Van Tillians who were saying that, there's this idea in which Calvin's sensus divinitatis is this idea of these almost, Platonic innate ideas, and that it's like this pre-downloaded sort of information that's actually present. It's not just a principle in the human intellect and will, but it's an actuality, and that's what causes this responsibility, and that's what it's. And I was just curious to hear your thoughts on his interaction. And I guess it comes also down to anthropology. And we've been talking a lot about, just having what is our anthropology in talking about the will, in talking about, the intellect. And I just wanted to hear some thoughts on how would we respond to this, Van Tillian argument that some do put, not all, there's a wide spectrum of, I guess, presuppositionalists and Van Til. They're not all alike. But how would we respond to this, general idea that there is this, sort of, this actual knowledge, almost present, immediate, not me. And so when they use the term immediate, they're saying that there's no mediating factor that presents this knowledge, which we would probably say, is revelation in the idea of general, and special revelation. How would we respond? Maybe Jacob Brunton has something to say to this, but what are some good responses to the idea of, the principle and potency of this knowledge, and then also the distinction between mediate and immediate?
So I think that the essential issue that I would point out in that is the epistemological issue of whether or not there is such a thing as innate knowledge, right? So we could affirm that there is an innate capacity to know, which I think is the same thing as what you mean when you say principle, right? It's a contentless capacity, which I think objectivists would also affirm, that they're saying that man's conceptual faculty is capable of certain things. It's got an quote unquote innate capacity to do certain things because of its nature, right? So we absolutely affirm that. What we wouldn't affirm is that there is innate content in that faculty or in that or given by that capacity. But I would also note that this isn't unique to presuppositionalists, right? So as you said, not all presuppositionalists would affirm innate knowledge, but it's also true that there are many others besides presuppositionalists who might affirm innate knowledge or something very similar, automatic knowledge, which is what reformed epistemologists would advocate, right? And I for epistemological purposes, I would lump them into the same basket. That there are some differences, but mostly they're similar. And the essential issue, like I said, is about whether or not there's innate knowledge. And the essential reason that I would disagree with the concept of innate knowledge or even automatic knowledge, if we're talking about reformed epistemology, is that knowledge is supposed to be justified true belief. And if there is such a thing as innate knowledge, I can't see how there is such a thing as justification for it, right? Epistemic justification for the belief, right? So you might find yourself believing something true about God, either because you were born with that belief in your head, or because it automatically pops into your head whenever you see a beautiful sunrise, or that's Alvin Plantinga's example. But either way, whether you're born with it or whether it just automatically pops into your head, the question is, do you have a reason for believing it? Do you have a reason for saying this is true versus this is false, right? Because I might find myself believing that God exists, but I might also find myself believing that homosexuality is okay and that God is fine with it, right? And the question is, how do I differentiate between the true belief that God exists and the false belief that homosexuality is okay according to God's plan and God's design? And if I don't have a way to distinguish between the veracity of the one and the falsity of the other, then I don't have justification, and then it's not knowledge. And so I think that's the essential issue to get down to in that whole topic. And when it comes to what Calvin believed or what Calvin taught regarding the sensus divinitatis, my general disposition is I don't really care much to argue that Calvin would have agreed with me, right? I think there's probably a way to read him which would make it so that he's understood in the same line of thought as the classical line of thought. But even if that's not the case, that's not a huge loss in my mind. I don't think that's something that is worth a lot of effort in debating. Some historians might want to do that. Josh Summer would probably be more interested in that. He's more historically minded, and that's great. But I don't think the debate boils down to that one way or the other.
Any other thoughts you had on that, Jacob Karn?
No, that was a good response. I mean, I do know in my reading of Calvin, he tends to favor, I guess, Plato, in that he doesn't. He says that Plato comes the closest out of all the philosophers to, in a sense of Christian truth. And so I was wondering if that kind of influenced the idea of the innate ideas, and then Calvin reappropriating it maybe to a sensus divinitatis, and that's where the Van Tillians are pulling it from. But then there's also the important notion that it's funny how the term Calvinist is used today, when in reality Calvin isn't the determining theologian. I mean, there were more people, more Reformed theologians who were more influential than Calvin in developing Reformed thought. And so it's not like, I mean, even if Calvin was positing this pre-downloaded innate ideas information, there's a whole host of other like Turretin and other classical Reformed thinkers that would probably articulate it differently. So I was just curious to know what exactly the presuppositionalists were pulling from when they try to argue this immediate, like K. Scott Oliphant and different people like that. So
yeah, I think it might be helpful to point out regarding Plato and Calvin's influence by Plato. I think Calvin's agreement with Plato was more regarding things like divine simplicity and the classical attributes of classical theism, which Plato did a lot of good philosophical work in sort of identifying, and then Augustine came after him and sort of, Christianized it, so to speak, but accurately so, we would say, right? So I think that's probably more of how Calvin would have agreed with Plato. To my knowledge, I don't think Calvin ever explicitly advocates for the idea of innate knowledge or like pre-downloaded knowledge the way that Plato did. So I don't think that you could say that the presuppositionalists are getting that idea from Calvin. I think that they're possibly reading it into him, or you could say maybe Calvin had that in mind, but he never explicitly said it one way or the other, to my knowledge. Anyway.
I would want to look at the term sensus divinitatis and ask, what did he mean when he said sense, like sensus? Is that we are born with having the idea, or does that mean that we're born with having the capacity of sensation, kind of like we have the capacity to sense color? I can't make an argument until I've looked at that in more depth, but that's probably, if there is any kind of equivocation going on or trickery from the Ventillians, that's probably part of it. All right, so Chad had asked a question, and we have time for that. As long as I don't hear my kids stirring upstairs, I'll let you know. So you'd asked a question about comparing Sam Harris's free will book. Was there anything that you wanted to point out? Is he still on the video?
No, he put in the chat he had to go.
I see. There we go.
Yeah.
But just missed him.
We'll cover it.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot to say about the Sam Harris book because I've read it like twice now. It was what I read it when I was not, believing in God, and I actually found it in a bookstore in Kansas City, pulled it off the shelf, was like, I want to flip through this, and I just stood there until I read the whole thing, and I set it back, and after that I was like, no, there's no such thing as free will. And you see the same package deal happening in Sam Harris, where he says, this is so unfair, because he kind of course, he is a materialist, and so he might say that consciousness is an emergent property, but that doesn't really get around the fact that it's all owing to material cause and effect with molecules that comprise your brain matter. But he still employs some of the same kind of common sense things, like, what would be the difference? What would be the determining factor of you making one choice over another? Although he's explaining it in physical terms, some of the same things that we would use to critique libertarian free will pop up in his book, but he immediately lumps that in and says, well, man, how are we going to punish criminals now? He goes that he puts the same, he makes the same equation of certain ideas that are not the same idea that Peikoff makes. And I think it's better to make Peikoff's error, because like we all see, like I think we would all agree, there is a very fundamental sense in which I can feel myself thinking of these sentences. I can feel myself deciding to, well, I won't go down that line of thought, I'll go down this line of thought. And Sam Harris would be like, that's an illusion. And of course the question within is like, an illusion to whom? But it is the same error, I think, that Harris makes in his book, because he actually starts the book talking about this really, really, really heinous group of criminals that do this awful torture to these innocent people. And he says, and I'm going to show you that they didn't really have a choice in that. And again, he's still buying in, even though he might make some good observations against the proponent of libertarian free will. Sam Harris is forced into this by being a biological determinist and a materialist. So I would almost say I agree far more with Peikoff on free will, even though he's not following, the principles of sufficient reason, than I would with Sam Harris. Even though when I read it when I was, 15 or something, I thought it was like brilliant. I think we would all probably say Peikoff is closer to the Christian conception of free will. He's just making the same error in thinking that if there was a God who knew everything, you wouldn't be free. I would just encourage anyone who still feels that way, and maybe Chad, I think he's non-Calvinist, so just try to identify in your mind why that would be the case. What about God's omniscience or sovereignty would make that the case that you're not free? Try to pinpoint it, because it's actually hard if you want to put it in concrete terms.
That's really well said. Thank you for that. Okay, so we're getting to the end of our video today, and if there's anyone that wants to add any other topics for discussion, we do have time, I think. So any other questions or things you want to get off your chest?
Yeah, I wanted to just, and this is more or less an observation, potentially a question, and this goes back to the first cause, focus being a first cause, I think. So the first thing is an observation and wondering if I'm getting this right. So the assertion is that we only develop our values if we have an active mind, if we're actually focusing our mind. That's when we're enabled to truly develop meaningful values. And these values will impact our future choices in a deterministic fashion. So if you then work backwards from that, the question is there a choice that doesn't connect back to a value? Right? If the idea is that all choices are essentially determined by your values or who you are as a person or who you've become as a person, and who you've become as a person depends on whether or not you've chosen to focus and have an active mind. Is there any choice that doesn't fall under this category? And I think that they're saying that the choice to focus would be that choice.
That is correct.
Yeah, so then my question is, and I guess the question there is in general, how do we make that choice? What is there any cause, or is it truly, how can it be causeless to focus one's
And
mind?
is it praiseworthy? That there might be a good answer to that question, even assuming Peikoff is right, that I don't understand. But like, how is it praiseworthy if it's not made for a certain goal? Because he critiques Kant's deontological ethics by saying, "Oh, now we just have a categorical imperative. We don't make it for any reason." And Peikoff laughs at that, rightfully so. But like,
how is it virtuous?
Right? How is that primary choice virtuous?
This is where the issue of libertarian free will is going to meet with the issue of overall ethics or theory of morality in the objectivist system, because they will grant that, yes, or they likely would grant, and many non-objectivist advocates of libertarian free will even would grant that, okay, yes, there are senses in which we form character over time, and then that character can be deterministic on future actions. But what they want to insist is, but at some point back in history, there had to be a point of non-determined choice. There had to be a choice that was not sufficiently caused by prior influences or causes. And I think the objectivists would say the same thing, that even if we grant that there's some sense in which your current character is deterministic on your future choices, there had to be a first choice that was not deterministically caused or sufficiently caused, right? That violates the principle of sufficient reason is how we would put it. And the reason, I think, I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty positive that the motivation for them saying that had to be the case is because in their mind, that there has to be moral significance, right? So if it was sufficiently caused, that first choice to focus or not, then it seems like we can't assign any moral value to it. Does that make sense?
It does. Jacob, we should wrap up our discussion today with if there's any other points that you would like to make about this overall subject. I know it's not necessarily engaging directly with the chapter, but if there's anything that you want our listeners to take away on this topic that would be clarifying to them.
Yeah, I think going back a little bit to the Sam Harris topic and the issue of materialism, I think it's going to be really helpful to try to keep in mind the distinction between sufficient material causation, which is what the materialists who oppose libertarian free will would affirm, and sufficient, you could say, psychological causation or sufficient spiritual causation, or basically the difference between we Christians who oppose libertarian free will and the Sam Harrises who oppose libertarian free will is that on the Sam Harris view, on the materialistic view, there is material causal sufficiency such that there is nothing other than material chemical interactions to what we're talking about as the agent, right? When Sam Harris says you made a choice, but you making that choice was an illusion, what he means is there is no you. There's just synapses firing. There's just chemical reactions. There is no you over and above the physical material causal chain. And the fact that you've got this sensation of a you is an illusion, meaning it's a byproduct of that causal interaction. But the you is not, it's causally impotent. It doesn't have any causal powers. All the causal powers are on the material physical level with the chemicals and the synapses and everything else. The you is just a byproduct of that. It doesn't have any causal efficacy. Versus, and right, Andrew was right. Peikoff is right to reject that. There is a real you over and above the material physical world. And the real you does have causal efficacy. It has causal powers, right? We agree with that. And the only thing that we're adding is there are non-physical sufficient causes to the non-physical you making the choices that you make, right? And those non-physical sufficient causes would be things like motive and other aspects of character and ideas and things like that. But even going back to a very first choice, because that's where you have to go if you're going to be consistent with this. If you're going to be consistent with a principle sufficient reason approach to this, you have to say that even the very first choice to focus or not to focus was sufficiently caused by your own internal, non-material, non-physical, spiritual self. And of course, as Christians, we would say that your first choice was not to focus, and your default is not to focus because of the fact that you are born with a nature inclined not to focus, a nature inclined towards sin and against reality. And that is morally culpable, right? That's our view. Now, there's lots of potential questions and objections about that, which we can maybe address some other time. But it's really helpful to distinguish our view from the physical causal determinism view.
Great. Thank you for explaining that. This helps us see that what we would advocate for the New Christian Intellectual is a more consistent answer to the theory of materialism. We are attempting to be even more consistent anti-materialists than the objectivists are on this issue. Now, as I would wrap up our video for this week, I want to point out, just if you're looking at the question of Calvinism, if you're looking at the question of God's meticulous sovereignty, here are some passages that you might want to consider in the scripture, just looking at it in order of where they appear. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph says, "As for you, you meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good." So there can be intentions in a person and intentions in God. And in two different senses. They're both correct. If you look in Exodus 9:12, but the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, it also says several times in Exodus that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, but also it says many times that the Lord hardened his heart. And in Romans 9, Paul takes that as his paradigm for explaining this issue, which Romans 9 is, of course, the passage that the Calvinists are going to use in order to articulate their view. Moving forward in the Bible, we'll go to Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. So if this is true, if the scripture is true on what it is saying in that passage, then can you deny that God is meticulously sovereign over what the king's heart wills? And then finally in Acts 2:23, perhaps the most profound, Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. So this was the doing of lawless men. It was the choice of lawless men. And yet it was by the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. So those have to be compatible. God's meticulous sovereignty in that situation is compatible with the thoughts and the actions of lawless men. So those are some ideas. And I think that, it's a challenging thing. I'm not going to just be the kind of person that looks at a non-Calvinist and says, get your theology right. I struggled with it for years before I embraced Calvinism. It was John Frame that brought me into Calvinism. And I wish it were someone else, because the journey, the path that John Frame set for me was confusing and it required a lot of work. So don't use him. But maybe you want to find something in Turretin, or there would be other recommendations. Does anyone on the video right now want to recommend any resources? R.C. Sproul,
Edwards,
Jonathan Edwards.
Just listen on audiobook to The Freedom of the Will. His whole point is you actually kind of need what he wouldn't call this. He would call it necessity, or like the principle of sufficient reason, to have praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. It's so clear, and it's funny too. If you can get a good reading of the audiobook.
Yeah, he's very sarcastic and witty in it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate everybody. It means so much to me that we're able to have this level of discussion. This is what FTNCI exists for. Everybody, please get on the email list for updates, christianintellectual.com/subscribe. And you can enroll in this ongoing series of discussions going all the way through August of this year. And it's free, and it's 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. or a little after Eastern, Saturdays. Go to christianintellectual.com/objectivism. Hey, everybody, you are a blessing, and I will pray that you have a wonderful week and that you will be able to use the material that we've worked through today, that this will make your life better. I appreciate everybody. God bless.